Oh, wait a second. Oh, shit. I have to do I can't tell if it's moving.
Well, thank you all for coming. My father's been working on this project for the last 2 months. Has been in practice in the city of Albany for 60 years. And his heart's in the city of Albany. He was born here. He came back after being in college at Penn State University and serving in the war. And he's just been a real wonderful influence on a number of architects and engineers in the area. And he's been kind of behind the scenes on a lot of projects. You've seen the Nipper warehouse story, I'm sure, a number of times. But as far as reshaping the city, it's really been an honor working with him for the last 25 years. And a number of architects have been trained under my father, including many noted firms in the area. And as
All right, I'll try again. This presentation is one of the most interesting and educational projects in my 60 years of practice in architecture in Albany. In 1958, our office was given the commission to construct an office building on a vacant lot on Swan Street, across the 8th Street from the Alfred E. Smith office building and extending south on Chestnut Street. And I will refer to this project as the Baroga building, because they were the people who were in charge of developing the building. Today, this building today is identified as 90 South Swan Street. The building was originally slated to be 6 stories high, but was modified to a 4-story in height as an accommodation to the Fort Frederick's apartment located directly behind it.
Where do I go?
Well, the building actually, the Fort Frederick's behind. That's the Fort Frederick's behind. Okay, good. Okay. This area of Albany was called Capitol Hill and extended to the Hudson River. In prehistoric times, there was a large body of water that referred to this area was a large body of water, and it was called Lake Albany. This lake covered the Capitol Hill, that's where the Capitol all the way down to the Hudson River and into the lands to the south. The Ice Age, during the Ice Age, the clay replaced the water with layers of very fine silt that turned to clay. This special clay was called blue clay. We were warned that any excavation or heavy building construction on this clay could cause the building to slide. The presence of this blue clay gave rise to an important common brick manufacturing industry in the area south of Albany. And I think people know it was probably one of the biggest brick manufacturers in the United States. In planning the construction of the Baroga building, I recalled my experience in designing another building in that neighborhood for Sage College in 1952. On that site, we were warned that the unique subsoil condition we were warned of unique subsoil condition for construction. In my approach to the design and construction of the Baroga building, my structural engineer not only provided special foundation walls and footings to restrict any movement of our building on this unique subsoil. But I would also to prevent the 8-story Fort Frederick's building from sliding into our building, and that building let's see, that building way. Yeah, that's right. Something about the wind. That was a very heavy building, and so the subsoil. They told me the building weighed about 4,000 tons of mass. So it really was a scary thing for me to start putting a building or excavating a building next to that building. And as you probably know, this is something that you don't do without a lot of research. So it's a well-known story that in 1860, during the construction of the New York State Capitol, it was discovered that the completed first-floor structure was sliding down the Capitol Hill. This condition was attributed to the blue clay subsoil. To restrict this movement, they built a 40-foot high, 166 wide granite staircase in front of the east facade. And the east facade is parallel with the Hudson River to stop the building's movement and buttress the finished structure. Now you've all seen that staircase that runs up that front of Capitol, and the only reason it's there is to hold the building down. And that was done back in 1880, so it's doing a good job. I'm going. All right, in order to avoid any future construction concerns of the Baroga design, I researched the original drawings of the Fort Frederick's apartments, built in 1916. The foundation and basement of the structure was built behind my building, and that was done in 1926. 10 years afterwards, building is built, and foundation, staircase, basement is built 10 years later. How come? In the words of the popular radio announcer, Paul Harvey, Albany City historian, Tony Opaka, author, has written a story about this building moving, and he will tell you the rest of the story.
Okay, well, thank you, Harris. That's always a great story. And I want to say that I had heard of Harris Sanders almost 40 years ago and only had the pleasure of meeting him, I think, for this project. I've met his son Danny before, but Harris and I just were introduced for getting prepared for this project. And I want to tell you, this guy is truly amazing. He's done so many interesting things in Albany. Nipper, the Ciccarelli Funeral Home that's on the Delaware Avenue branch, and I'm sure there are other things that he hasn't told me yet, but I want to find out. He needs his own show, his own recording, because he's got a lot of stories to tell about Albany architecture. These are the buildings that we're talking about here. You see the Alfred E. Smith building, built starting in 1926, opened in 1929. The Fort Frederick, as you can see, having been moved a block, and the Baroga building that Harris talked about. This is, by the way, a little drawing that Harris did recently. You can see on the right is the Fort Frederick, an image of the Fort Frederick in its original location at the corner of Washington and Swan. And it's 8 stories, and the Alfred E. Smith building is 31 stories, I think, and then you can see on the left where it was moved, and that's what this story is going to be about. I knew a little bit about this story, about the move of the building, but I didn't really know much about the building itself. So I ended up doing a little bit of research, not as much as could really be done. And I found out that the Albany County Hall of Records, how many people have ever been there, by the way? I would recommend it just for the fun of it. It's got so many amazing things in it. And one of the things it's got is a nearly complete record of building permits in Albany from about 1905, 1908, with some even earlier, some back before 1900, all the way up to the present. And over the last 30 years, they have organized the collection and computerized it. So you can put in an address, you can ask them to find an address, and they'll find a permit number. And I, of course, had to look for this as 70 South Swan, which was its original street address when it was built on the corner of Washington and Swan. And as you can see, the building permit drawings are dated November 1st, 1915. On the left is the front elevation, which faced what is now the West Capitol Park, and the side elevation on the right faced Washington Avenue. The major entrance was on the Swan Street side. And at the time the building was built, it was in a dense area. The area was entirely built up. If you've ever seen pictures of the Capitol Fire of 1911, you'll see that there are buildings all the way from Congress Street, which was a street that ran between State and Washington behind the Capitol, all the way up to the corner of Swan. And in the early 20s, it was decided that there would be a new state office building built, and rather than build it directly behind the Capitol, it would be built west of Swan, and the area between the Capitol and Swan would be cleared for a park, and we know that now, of course, as West Capitol Park. I want to just mention a little bit about the background of apartment buildings in Albany, or apartment buildings generally in the United States. They really came in the middle of the 19th century, and they were kind of frowned upon because people of a certain class did not live among other people. That was only for working class people. People that could afford their own buildings were expected to live in their own residential buildings. But as early as the 1850s, there was a housing crisis in New York City, and apartment buildings, multi-unit apartment buildings, started to sneak in. One of the reasons that they weren't originally accepted was that they were known as French flats, and the French were considered a little licentious or something. So, you didn't want to be associated with anything French. But later they became accepted because, of course, they were needed. That was the only way people were going to be able to afford to live. And it took a while. I mean, we're talking the 1850s, 60s, 70s. It's happening in New York City. But it took a while for it to get to smaller cities like Albany and Syracuse and so on. But it did happen by 1900. The earliest apartment buildings of this type were built in Albany probably around the turn of the 20th century. And as I said in the slide here, you can see that the building permit for this, well, I should say the drawings were dated November 1st, 1915. The building permit would have been pulled probably very soon after that. The building was built by Gary Dillenbeck, a pharmacist who was a resident of Slingerland, and Dr. Thomas Ryan, who was a doctor at 74th South Swan, which was the building immediately to the left. And under the name of Garth Ward Realty, which is on this drawing, they decided to build this speculative apartment building. The building was only 10 years old, as Harris mentioned, when the state decided to put the Alfred E. Smith building, which originally was just called the State Office Building. The Alfred E. Smith name was given later. The building was 10 years old, and apparently Ryan and Dillenbeck sold the building to Waldron Estates, and I think there are people here who probably recognize the name Tenike Mosher, a real estate firm that lasted well into, I think maybe into the 1960s, and they called themselves Waldron Estates. It was Tenike Mosher and H.F. Rosecrans. They decided to move the building, and they acquired a site at State and Swan Some of the occupants of that site had been John G. Myers. Of course, everybody remembers John G. Myers. His son-in-law, H. King Sturdy, but by the time the building was moved, his widow was a resident of England. And then there was a Dr. C.S. Merrill, who knows the name Edgar Van Olinda? People remember that name? Sure. He wrote a newspaper article about it. He said 16 years ago, so he was writing in 1942 about the move of the Fort Frederick in 1926. He called it a double brownstone mansion at 248 State Street, and there was another building at 244 State Street that was occupied by General John Patterson of the U.S. Army. When the state took the property over, Waldron was given 60 days to clear the site, and Eaton Wrecking Company was awarded the contract to remove the other buildings. The Foundation Company of New York, who built foundations for Home Savings Bank, which was going on probably around the same time, prepared a new foundation for the Fort Frederick as well. Now, the funny thing is, Harris mentioned that the building weighed 4,000 tons. And I think this is probably one of the vagaries of actually hand typesetting newspaper articles, because I saw it listed as 400 tons, 4,000 tons, and 48,000 tons. I'm going to go with the 4,000. I think that's probably the most accurate. It was moved 475 feet. Now, they said it was 350 feet from Washington to State, and then probably the extra 125 feet was moving it west of the west of the corner there. It was moved about 2 to 3 feet a day in the beginning, and then about 7 feet a day later. And one of the things I found in looking at these fantastic drawings is that I can't figure out what happened in this building. You can see the name of the building permit there. The name of the architect is Pember and, what is it, Merrick and Pember. And looking at the drawing on the top, and this set of drawings probably has 100 drawings with it, everything from floor plans to structural to mechanical drawings. But studying that floor plan on the top, I can't figure out what happened to it. I have a feeling, I've never been in the building, so I can't say for certain what happened. But I don't think some of that interior floor plan was constructed the way this drawing was drawn. The two in the center at the top, on either side, you can see there's a sort of a square room in the center. On either side of that are kitchens. And then there are living rooms, dining rooms, bedrooms, and bathrooms. And that sounds reasonable enough, but there are only 2 kitchens, and this drawing is labeled typical floor plan. So it's 2 through 8. And there were offices and stores on the first floor, and then apartments on floors 2 through 8. But I counted the way these rooms are laid out. There are 2 kitchens, 3 living rooms, 2 dining rooms, 5 bedrooms, and 4 bathrooms. And that doesn't make any sense at all. So I have no idea. And I was also able to find the building in the 1920 census. And there were 19 heads of household listed. And this was a weird one, too, because they actually had the addressing correct in the 1920 census. I was able to figure out, corroborating the census with the city directory, what they called 70 Dove Street was actually 70 South Swan Street. So there were 19 heads of household, and I think that means there were people missing. There were people that were listed in the city directory that you wouldn't know from the city directory that were actually living in the same unit. Like that, I don't know if anybody's ever looked at the census, but it talks about head of household and then relationship to head. So there were some that were head, wife, servant, daughter, son, whatever. But there were some that were head and sister. And when you look at the city directory, they have different last names. So you wouldn't realize that that was actually one unit. But I don't see, if you study this drawing, all of the rooms are connected. And so somebody, and one of the rooms on the bottom there, I think that the big room in the center says living room, but it has a bathroom to the left and the right of it, and each of the bathrooms has 2 doors. So you go through the bedroom, or you go through the bathroom to get from the living room to the bedroom. So the floor plan doesn't make any sense. I don't understand it. I'd love to see the interior of the building to see what was actually built. And of course, I'm sure that it's been altered since its original construction. But you can see pretty much, I mean, again, the treasure trove of drawings and records at the Albany County Hall of Records. This is one that happened to have its complete set. Now, this gives you an idea. The Sanborn insurance maps were published periodically, and they were done for insurance purposes. So they were, the purchasers of these maps wanted to know what the building was made of, how many stories it had, how it was located in proximity to other buildings. So you can see this is just a little section that goes Washington State, Chestnut, Lancaster. And the original site, this is 1909, before the Fort Frederick was built. And you see the 2 large squares where it says new site of Fort Frederick. Those are the 2 buildings that Van Olinda was talking about that were demolished to accommodate the Fort Frederick. Now what you see also on the west side of Swan is a row of buildings facing Swan, and you see, what does that one say in the middle? Is that, it's not Congress. Oh, is that Spring Street maybe that's coming into Swan? That's like the middle of Capitol Park now. And then there are a few buildings on the corner facing State Street, and you see the, what is that, the 4th building, I guess? That's actually the location of Albany Law School, which didn't move over to New Scotland Avenue until they were displaced by the Alfred Smith building. So the buildings that you see, the Fort Orange Club on Washington Avenue, just about under the word Avenue there. So all those buildings on Washington east of Swan, or I mean east of the Fort Orange Club to Swan, all the buildings on Swan itself, the 3 buildings before the law school itself, and a few buildings to the west of that were all those buildings that were taken for the Alfred Smith building. The moving company was the, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, I'm going to say Eichlein from Pittsburgh, and this company was formed in 1875, and a friend of mine sent me a link to an article today in anticipation of this. There's a big building in Glens Falls that was moved, I think, in the early 20th century, and it was moved by the same company. So they had a reputation. They moved several buildings in, what's the capital of West Virginia? Is that Charleston? Charleston. They were building a new capital in the early 20th century, and this company moved a number of buildings out of the way of that. They moved a number of buildings in Pittsburgh. They seem to be pretty active in the Northeast, maybe beyond. But what I found on their website was that they built a number of moved a number of buildings in the Northeast. Now, from here on, I have to thank a good friend of mine, Barbara Casey, who is a dealer, not a dealer, I should say, a collector of Albany ephemera. And several years ago, she bought a collection of 82 photographs of the moving of the Fort Frederick apartments. And they are dated and numbered, and I've got 10 of them here. I tried to pick out the ones that really kind of show the story the best. And the last picture, number 82, you'll see it here. I am sure from the detail that these people, these photographers did, these may have actually been done by the moving company. There's so much detail, and the pictures were taken virtually every day that there's no question. The last picture that she has is water damaged. And there's no question in my mind that the last ones were actually lost, so that you see the building before it's on its final foundation. There's no doubt that they photographed it to the very end, because there's so many detailed photographs before that. But the irony of this, of course, is that I don't know the exact date of this photograph. Some of them don't have dates, but you'll see that three-story row house to the left of Fort Frederick. That is the residence of Dr. Thomas Ryan, who built, he and Dillenbeck were the partners that built the Fort Frederick. And then 10 years later, he was displaced by the state and moved to 546 Myrtle Avenue by 1927. So he's actually a Pine Hills resident in his later life. So I'm going to just kind of run through these, and we're going to see the moving of the building from the corner to its final location. What I think is interesting about the demolition shots is that they didn't have any large equipment here. They were almost like dismantling the buildings. You see how there are sheets coming out of the windows, and the buildings were pretty much taken down by hand. And I'm not sure exactly why they did that, but they clearly did. The building that you see in the background is the back wing of the Fort Orange Club. And you can see the fire escapes on the Fort Frederick on the right. The steeple on the left is Westminster Presbyterian Church on State Street. And here, again, wherever there were dates, I put them on the labels there. You're looking south towards State Street on that, and the buildings that you see in the background are probably those ones just above Swan that were between the corner and the law school. And you can see that they're preparing the foundation. They're destroying the foundation. The photographer is standing right on Washington Avenue. That's the west corner of the building that you see on the left. And you see also that the building to the west of it touched it. So in the drawings it says no windows on the first 4 floors. Below once you get to the 5th floor, you've got windows on the west side of the building. Here it is, you recognize the State Education Building in the background and the Cathedral of All Saints beyond it. And you're looking now at the south side of the building. The buildings to the left are the ones still on Washington Avenue between the Fort Frederick and the Fort Orange Club. But it looks like everything else has been removed going towards Swan Street. These are the buildings, well actually no, I guess, let's see. October 23rd. Okay, so I'm guessing the photographer is actually standing behind these buildings. This is the corner of Swan Street, looking sort of northwesterly at what would now be the corner of the Alfred Smith building. You see the space between the 3rd building and the building beyond that. That's where the Albany Law School stood. So, and now you can see the tracks have been laid. Those are ties and basically railroad tracks, and hundreds and hundreds of rollers. Now we're looking south. The buildings on the right there that are partly demolished are the last buildings before the row on State Street begins. And the building on just to the left of that, almost at the exact center of the photograph, is actually still there, except that the facade of it was completely redone in probably the 1950s. But if you look at the side of that building, as you're walking down State Street, you'll see the gabled roof and the old windows, but this has a modern brick front on it now. And the building to the right of that, I think, is still there, probably looking pretty much like that. Okay, so you see where it is now. The building on the right, the partially demolished building, is on Washington Avenue. The building behind that is the Fort Orange Club. Now you can see the Emmanuel Baptist Church steeple, and the Fort Frederick is blocking the view of the Westminster Presbyterian Church. You can see that it's probably about halfway there.
Okay.
And now you can see right at the corner, the full view of the Fort Orange Club, full view of the Baptist Church steeple, and then the short building on the left is the building immediately west of the Fort Frederick today. That's the building on State Street that got the new front. And this is the last of my friend Barbara's photographs. And you can see the date of December 1926. The building is in a snowstorm, and it's sitting in the middle of the street. You can see the Westminster steeple immediately to the left of it, and then the building during the move, and people came home every night to, right, yeah. But how do you do that with like flexible gas pipes? You know, I mean, I'm hoping they had, you know, safe passage. And so, I mean, it's really kind of an incredible story, you know. I guess you got a different view every day. Yes, the horses, I don't remember if the horses are pictured in Barbara's collection, but they supposedly walked around with two, what do they call them? Winches? Yeah, winches, not winches. And, you know, they were just walking around, I guess, and there were two teams, and, you know, I mean, it sounds sort of primitive. What's that? Yeah, there were cables that were wrapping around a post. So did you?
I think instead of horses, I recall hearing from a photographer who shot that when they were doing it, that they were mules.
Mules? Okay.
So that makes more sense.
Okay.
My son said the horses would have died.
Okay.
Oxen were used in those days.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So,
Were any of these pictures in the Morris Gerber collections?
what's that?
Was any of these photos
No, I
in
think
the Morris
I've
Gerber
never
collection?
seen any of the moving pictures
No.
other than my friend's collection. I'm sure that there are pictures of it where it was on Washington and Swan. And there, you know, obviously there are photographs, later photographs of it at 248 State Street. So the thing is, when you see this building, you know, you're looking at the State Street elevation for the most part. You have to look down the little side entrance there to see the front, because it's got a big canopy on it. And that was the original front entrance. Because they didn't reorient the building, they just moved it, you know, moved it south and west a little bit.
Was it moving right on Swan Street then?
No, it was never, no, the picture shows it, that the building that Harris designed was actually originally the front yard of this building. There were two buildings on State Street that were taken out, and they appear to be about the same size as the Fort Frederick. So the western building, which was the John G. Myers home, is where the Fort Frederick was, or is, and the 244 State was the General Patterson from the U.S. Army. That was the building, that occupied the corner itself.
But I wondered if they had moved the building eastward to Swan Street and then made it, you know, a turn
They moved it southward, or south first. Straight line. And then they must have done something, you know, again, the photo collection. Yeah, they had to move it west in order to provide for that front yard, because the building was not, the building was right on the corner of Swan and Washington, but it's set back from the corner of Swan and State.
Oh, you know the history of the name of the building?
Well, Fort Frederick, of course, is the replacement of Fort Orange. Fort Orange lasted from 1624 to 1676, and Fort Frederick, which I think was named after some relative, by that time the Dutch were gone and it was English, and Fort Frederick stood on the State Street Hill in front of St. Peter's Church. So it's another, you know, it's kind of funny to have the Fort Orange Club and the Fort Frederick apartments 1 block away from each other. You know, the two, there was a Fort Albany, but that would be kind of uninteresting to call the building. You know, Fort Frederick and Fort Orange are much more interesting. Yeah.
Were all the rails built at once, or did they sort of run the rails as they...
No, it looks like they built them at once, because one of the photographs shows the rails going all the way from one end of the block to the other. So, you know, I don't know whether I guess what they did was move it a little, pull the rollers and put them on the front of the building, then move it a little, grab those rollers and keep moving it like that. So, but yeah, let me go back to that. You know, it looks like the rails are virtually all there. You know,
Do that today. They put the building on the
yeah, yeah.
There's a lot of houses in Albany, 45 years after this, were moved out of the west end of the
Sure,
city.
around 85 was that?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't, how many people know the Hamilton Grange? That's Alexander Hamilton's house in New York, and that got recently moved. And that was moved twice actually, because they didn't move buildings. I mean, a long time ago they moved buildings, but they had to, in the time that was moved, a church was built that blocked it from the street. So that building had to be raised up 40 feet, carried across the roof of the church, and then dropped back down to the street, and then moved on a hill. But it was, they had to keep the building level. And I would highly recommend the short video that's in the Hamilton exhibit at the Albany Institute that shows, I think it's 30 days into 3 or 4 minutes. So the building looks like it's, you know, sliding down the hill. It's a great video, but it shows you what they had to do to get this building out from the back of the church where it was trapped. They had to lift it 40 feet, and I understand that they used, that they hired Mennonites or Amish people or something from Pennsylvania who had a skill. They built this pile of, they looked like railroad ties going in 4 directions to lift the building up, and then moved it, and then dropped it back down to the street level, and then moved it. They moved it a few blocks. The building, was, as I said, was moved twice. It stayed within probably a square mile of where it had been built in 1801 by Alexander Hamilton, but it was in the way twice.
You mentioned in passing the clay presence here in our area.
Yeah.
Was there any, has it been ascertained as to which of the manufacturers provided the bricks for the building?
For what?
For the building for the hotel?
You know, I'm sure there was, they could very well have been locally made brick, but anybody that was around for the 24-hour pile driving during the South Mall construction, that was the clay.
Yes.
I don't know how they missed that when they were planning the South Mall, but they ended up, I saw pictures of piles that were driven in that ended up like trees, you know, because they would split them and they just couldn't penetrate that clay. And that's one of the reasons that the construction took so much longer than anticipated.
Tell me a story about 1926. The state of New York condemned all the buildings along Swan Street, and the builders of the Fort Fredericks, just previously, 10 years before, built this building. And they were quite concerned that they wanted to tear it down and then rebuild it.
Yeah.
So they made a decision after they got their condemnation money. They each got the value of the property before they moved. They decided to investigate this mover. So he came in with a price that was half of what they were giving them.
Yeah, did people hear that? They were. That's as far as I can go.
That's why I can move. The builders who were directly involved with building, the movers rather, they were nationally known builders, and they have an advertisement they had back in the 18 something or other, that they can move your building cheaper than having to tear it down and then rebuild it. And that was their advertisement. So when this fellow that owned the Fort Fredericks, when they heard about that, they received their money, or condemnation money, from the state. Well, they said, well, let's talk to these people in Pittsburgh. So they contacted him, and they said, oh, we'll move it for you. And they told him what it would cost, and it happened to cost half of what it bid that the state gave them. So they made a profit by moving the building instead of tearing it down, losing the tenants, and then rebuilding it and getting new tenants.
Why didn't they think of that in 1962? Any other, yeah.
And one of the earlier photos there showed that the ground wall in another building,
Yeah.
with no windows. Did they
Yeah.
ultimately then put windows in?
I don't think so, no, I've actually, well, that's an interesting question too, because, let's see, where we can see that. Yeah, you can also see the fireproof tile that was put there, you know, that's not an exterior finish. So I'm assuming that, I've never actually looked at the back side of this, the west side of the building, but I'm sure they must have put a finished exterior wall surface on that after they put it into its final place. I don't think it touches the building. I can't imagine that it would, you know, you wouldn't want that crash, you know, when they moved it into place. You wouldn't want that, you know, hitting your building if you looked immediately to the west. Yeah, did you have a question?
Is there any estimate on how much it costs?
You know, I've never seen a cost connected with it. I'm sure there must be. Maybe the company, I didn't contact the company in Pittsburgh, maybe they have the records. They didn't have it, in fact, they didn't even have this online. Just that the newspaper said that that was the company that they used. Yeah.
Have there been any buildings moved recently?
What do you mean recently and where?
Well, what's the most recent movement, building movement you can think of here?
In Albany?
The barn.
What's that? Okay, there's a barn in New Scala. You know, when they built 787, I was living in at home in Waterville at the time 787 was built, and only one of the buildings near the Arsenal was moved out of the way. The rest of the buildings on Broadway and Waterville were demolished.
The majority of the homes, I think, were moved in the 60s to make way for I-90 and 787.
Yeah, and actually, if you know, the area I grew up in is called Maplewood, and on Route 7, when they built Route 7 up the hill, I think they moved about 40 buildings there, and that was all happening in the late 60s, just to get out of the way of the highway. Yeah.
Very recently, Schenectady by the Multiple Comics Shopping Center.
Oh, right, that's right. That's right. The building that stood in the middle of the field on, the Sanford House, Stanford House, was moved somewhere around that property. Yeah, yeah. That's probably the biggest thing that was moved recently in this area. Thank you for that. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Somebody have a question?
Yeah, I got a question. Okay, we work on moving these buildings. How did they hold the whole thing together when they were moving it?
Well, I guess structurally, you know, if they're going to build a building, it better stick together. You know, and I guess they decided. I mean, this moving company. You know, I've heard of other moving companies. There's one, I think. I don't think it was this one. No, there's another company that actually advertises. Well, this company is still in business, and there's another moving company I've investigated recently, and they moved a theater. I mean, like something the size of the palace.
Yes.
I mean, that's pretty amazing, but I guess the building, as long as it has structural stability. I thought of another building now that was moved very recently. The airport, when the airport expanded, the building that was on Route 7 that looked forlorn for 20 years or more had become part of the airport property. And it was a very historic building. It was reputedly the place where the first town meeting of the town of Waterville, which became the town of Colony, was held. The building was built, I think, before 1790. And it's a white clapboard building, maybe with green shutters, or it had green shutters. And what, do you know what the building? It's a, yeah, the Taylor T, is that the name of it? Yeah. And that was moved about 200 feet. I mean, that was a little less complicated than this, but it's a post and beam building. I mean, it's a very old construction technique. So I'm sure it was very fragile. It was in, as I said, looking pretty forlorn there for 20 years, and that, you know, it got stabilized and reopened. They put a concrete block foundation under it, but they used the foundation stones on the outside of it, so it looks like the original. They didn't change the orientation of the building. They moved it 200 feet, you know, parallel to itself, so it still faces the same way, and it's actually on the original property, so it didn't get you know, separated from its historic setting. Yeah.
To understand how well this was done, Google up Centennial Firehouse, Peekskill, New York, August 21st, 2008, and see what happened.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
That was Google up Centennial Hose Firehouse.
Oh,
Peekskill, New York.
Yes.
2008.
There's an incredible video of that building. Have you ever seen the video?
Yes.
It's like major oops. The building was, that was actually, I worked for the State Historic Preservation Office, and that was actually a mitigation for something. The building was being moved out of the way of a new development, and it was a small firehouse, like probably probably like the size of Steamer 10 right across the street. And you can literally watch the video of the move, and then all of a sudden something shifted improperly and it was a pile of bricks. Yeah, it's an amazing video. It really is, yeah.
Tony, have you ever researched to see if there's any 1917 newspaper articles discussing this brand new apartment house, or maybe
I'm sorry, I can't.
or advertising it as luxury apartments?
Whether this building was?
1917 newspaper articles, have you ever researched?
Yeah, I haven't done that here. I've, you know, this was, I haven't done a great deal of research on this particular building, but I'm sure that this was called, you know, fine apartments. Like some of the earlier buildings from the early 20th century were the Marcus Reynolds building on State Street, just west of Lark. That I think dates from 1905 or something like that. So that's 10 years earlier than this. That, I've been in that building, and those apartments were gigantic. Those probably had servants' quarters and you know, the back stairs and the service entrance and all that stuff. And that had a superintendent apartment in the basement and so on. So that was, I think, a little fancier than this one. The apartments, I think, were a couple thousand square feet apiece in the building on State Street. What is it, 355 State Street? Yeah.
As you say that, would servants' quarters relate to that weird floor plan?
I don't think so, because I did research on apartment buildings several years ago, and servants' quarters were connected. They were inside the apartment, but every apartment had its own door, and the servants' quarters would generally be behind the kitchen. So they would have a servant's bedroom and a bathroom, and they would go through the kitchen to the dining room, and they would be able to come through the service stairs, which were generally, you know, away from the front door. This floor plan is nothing like that. So I don't, like I said, I don't understand this floor plan at all. I'd love to know how it was actually built, because I don't think it was built this way. Unless maybe they blocked off some of those doors or something, because, you know, they're all connected. There was a hallway around the central court that you could walk 3/4 of the way around the building. But if you were inside the apartment or inside the living spaces, you could walk all the way around the building too, by going through bathrooms and bedrooms. That doesn't make any sense. So I don't know. Yeah.
Tony, Tom's uncle, he had a moving business in Rensselaer, in that era. And the family always talked about how he moved the building. So that company might have hired him because see it as local.
Yeah. Yeah, so often, like an architect will have a local architect, like if an architect from out of town designs a building, they'll often have a local architect to do like the supervision or something like that. Although the photograph that's in the Van Olinda article shows the man named Eichley here. So maybe they said, all right, you know, you can be our superintendents on location. But, you know, we're the ones that, you know, they're the ones, I guess, take the responsibility, pay the insurance or whatever, so. Anything else?
I was thinking that the rooms all being interconnected would allow for a larger or smaller unit to be designated. So some rooms could be designated to one side, one apartment.
That's possible.
And, you know.
That's possible, but the floor plan as drawn doesn't necessarily show that, you know. But then you'd have like, you know, your bathroom would have a door into the other apartment, even if it's locked. You know, you want kind of a solid wall between your apartment. You know, it certainly wouldn't pass code today, where you have to have, you know, separation, major separation between units. You know, maybe it was done that way and, you know, changed later or something, you know, drawn that way and changed later. It doesn't make any sense to me, because in 1920 there were 19 households listed in the census, but they certainly didn't have one floor, and they certainly wouldn't have needed 5 living rooms or whatever the number was on each floor. It's almost as if each floor was its own unit, but that was not the case. So I don't know, you know, it's a mystery.
They just drew that as the basic plan, and then, because it was still a relatively new concept here, so then all of a sudden when they started to then get tenants, then they started figuring, okay, so we're going to continue.
Yeah, that could very well be. Although I can't imagine that the city would give them a building permit for a building that was not going to be built the way it was drawn. You know, here's our application. This is what we think we're going to do, but maybe we'll change it. You know. Yeah.
The real novelty of this building is that the occupants maintain living conditions in it.
That's the weirdest part of the whole story.
In and out, you know, with the type of construction they have, you know. Credit to the masons and bricklayers of those days, you know, with much, they were almost self-supporting. I suspect those beams you see coming out of the holes cut in the bottom are called needle beams. They're actually supporting the building itself, and it comes over to the side girder, which is then on the rollers that the horses are pulling the whole weight of the building. But to keep it intact, I think we took the credit of the original.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an amazing story. You know, like somebody said, you know, one person asked, you know, if the building shifts, what happens? You know? I mean, like this firehouse in Peekskill, you know, but that's a much smaller building, and it was fully masonry construction. So not a steel frame building like this.
You probably know that the southern wing on the Alfred Smith building did settle because of the clay.
Oh, is that right? Okay, yeah, that's not a surprise. You know, you know, Harris talked about the staircase. And if you've ever walked up the staircase, you can see that it kind of slants into the building. So I think the building weight has pushed it so that the steps are not horizontal anymore. They're a little bit angled. And I think that probably is related to sliding down the hill.
I'm a structural engineer, and I'm reading a book about the dome in Florence, Italy, and I'm fascinated about the
Well, one of the
intelligence
reasons
of the people that were involved in that.
One of the reasons they dropped the idea of a dome on the Capitol was because of the weight that it was expected to generate, that it wouldn't stand. Sir, did you have a question?
Is there any information on any changes in the elevation of the street from beginning to end? And do they have to compensate on the railroad tracks? In other words, was there a slant or anything like that?
I'm sure they did. Yeah, if you look at a topographical map, this is not just perfectly flat. When they moved the Hamilton Grange, they had some serious hills, but they had to maintain the level of the building so that the building itself wouldn't break. And I would imagine that all of that was taken into consideration here too. So.
Other more questions? Yes,
Right, you know if this 8-story building had an elevator in it?
Oh, I'm sure it did, yeah. In fact, I think it shows on the plan. Yeah, they wouldn't have built anything that tall without an elevator. In fact, that's one of the invention of the elevator is what allowed buildings to get taller. People aren't going to walk up more than 5 or 6.
Any more questions? Yeah, I'm Paul Hacker, President of Friends of the Library. I do apologize for the small size of this space. I do appreciate your coming. And I guess Harris and Tony have agreed to do it, another presentation. Possibly we'll do it in a larger place down at the main library at a future date. But we'll keep informed about that. But I do thank Harris and Tony very much. And thank you all for coming. Thank you.